We're from Savills, obviously. We're an international multidisciplinary property practice, and we're going to talk today about sort of a process as opposed to a specific sort of planning, regulatory type experience. So a bit about who we are. My name's Andy Watson. I joined Savills in 2014. I've worked there for about 5 years now. Before that, I worked in London. Most of my clients at Savills at the moment are landowning clients across the southeast, so Sussex and Kent, institutional clients, charities, and so on. And I've got a lot of local experience of working in Brighton. I've worked on the Royal Sussex County Hospital redevelopment for my previous practice, and also done work at the University of Brighton at student halls of residence called Varley Halls, which is around sort of Coldene area.
Yeah, I'm Ewan Stoddart, head of the architecture department for Savills in Petworth. But again, lots of links to Brighton. Not that it's a competition, but I've been an architect for over 17 years. Worked for a local Brighton practice, very good local Brighton practice, sort of, learnt my trade. Lots of projects that I was involved with, starting off at a junior level. I think I designed a fire escape staircase at the Brighton Library on my first week when I was working there. And then sort of worked up to become sort of joint architect on projects, for example, like the open market redevelopment in Brighton. That's a project that I was really proud of, working alongside lots of other skilled professionals, and experienced across East and West Sussex. And a lot of work that I do is with the planning team and Andy and his little presentation. So over to you.
Thank you. Mouse isn't working. Oh, okay, right. Yeah. Right.
Just give up on that.
So what we're going to talk about today, we're starting off with a bit of the strategic planning context. I always think that's quite important to put us in the sort of the wider national picture. And then what we're going to really focus on today is how we work together as planners, architects, and with our viability development surveying colleagues to help inform the process early on and try and avoid mistakes happening further down the line by sort of rushing in. Ewan's then going to come on to talk about working with heritage, listed buildings, and how good design can add value. I'm not going to stand over this side, actually. So, first of all, this slide puts us in context. So we're obviously down here in Brighton. These various colours are the sort of land constraints that we have to deal with in the southeast. So you've obviously got the big one around here, the National Park, South Downs National Park. You've got the New Forest National Park further to the west, the sea, and then a sort of belt of development in between. So what does that mean is... The main thing, I guess, is that the demand is massively high in the southeast for new housing and so on. Supply is constrained. So it really puts an emphasis on sort of early stage working and understanding the constraints of a site and getting things right. But also, actually, just to add to that, dealing with these special landscapes, you have to take a different planning and design approach to what you would in sort of the urban areas of Brighton and Hove and so on. So, what are the issues that we deal with on a daily basis? We deal a lot with landowner-led development, and often, because it doesn't have that commercial edge to it, there's a tendency to not explore things in detail. It's very much, let's go and put a planning application in for 10 houses on this site. We want you to go and do a design, and we want you to write a planning statement. And we find ourselves sort of backtracking from that quite a lot and really analysing the site, getting to grips with it. And as I say, that helps looking forward when you do come to starting the design process. But also working with our development surveying colleagues, they look at things like the appropriate mix of housing, what is the demand for housing, do you want to go for apartments, do you want to go for family-sized housing? All of that focuses and helps to shape the design process. And then also from a planning perspective, the policy and legislative context is changing all the time. So from a policy perspective, local plans are coming forward with massive need for new housing. And also from a legislative perspective, you've got things like permitted development rights. Some of them are taken away, some of them extended, and it's all stuff that we need to keep an eye on to help advise our clients. So this slide's about sort of due diligence, and these are the sort of very early stage things when you're looking at a site. Do you have an access? A lot of the time, people come to us and say, well, look, it's an agricultural field, it's got an existing agricultural access, there's an access job done, that's fine. It's not as easy as that. You have to look at things like, can you get appropriate visibility from that access? Underground and overground utilities. Ewan's got various horror stories about a planning permission you got for a house on a water main or something.
In my early days, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's just literally you learn these things on the job, it was a case of a property, he was doing it for a friend, and he basically wanted to build a house on the land to the side of his house. oh, why is there an empty plot on the side of this house of otherwise buildings? You go ahead, you get the planning permission, everything's great. This was about 2003, 4, just to give some context of the fact it was a long time ago. We then go through the due diligence process, and it turns out there's a massive water main there, which basically provides half the water to half of that estate. And we got a quote from the water board, the water company, to remove and relocate that water main, and it was £350,000. So straight away, what was the point of the planning permission? Nothing. You learn these things, and with these guys on board, you've got to do these due diligence. And obviously, there's a list here of all the different things that you have to go through. You have to check these things. You have to comply with them. You have to make sure that the site is viable and it can work, because there's nothing worse than having a conversation with a client much further down the line when one of these things can actually potentially kill a project.
The other one we deal with quite a lot is trees. People look at a site and see a tree and say, right, we'll just take that out, job done. But it's not as easy as that. With things like ancient woodland, you have to provide appropriate buffers. So 15 metres is the sort of standard that you can have any development from the edge of ancient woodland. So it's really important to sort of screen these things early on in the process.
It's also worth mentioning we actually have tree experts and consultants. So we have a colleague of mine, Mark, who works alongside me at our Petworth office, and he basically travels around the UK offering advice on forests. And also he's got a colleague who's joining him in the next couple of weeks who also does the tree protection statements, tree protection orders. So it's another part of being able to have someone in that office with you that you can just go to and get that advice straight away.
So what we've done here is try to take some practical examples of sites that we're working on at the moment and show some of these things in practice. So one of the constraints, surface water. Again, most people think of look at the environment agency flood maps and they think rivers and coasts, and they're usually quite obvious if you're developing next to the sea or whatever. Surface water is less obvious. That's to do with sort of the topography of the site, the underlying geology, and on this site it ended up sterilising a large part of what could have been a developable part of the site. This is underground gas mains. Again, it's sort of this is all from the Health and Safety Executive mapping. So these are parts of the site where you have to be very careful about the type of uses you're putting onto different parts of the site. And again, most people see a nice greenfield site. They're often greenfield for a reason because of these underground constraints, and it's stuff that you just really need to think about early on in the process. So the process we like to follow, with bearing in mind this sort of thing, is looking at what are our constraints. So on this site, we have things like an ancient woodland here, so we have to provide a buffer. We have the gas main running down here, so we have to be mindful of that all along. That then leads into what are our opportunities, so things like the views out, areas that aren't sterilised by development could be developable, and things like we've got a rural station here, so that's a real opportunity for new housing. And then we would go on to do capacity testing. So here you can see that's the surface water flooding area, that's the gas main running in through there, that's the ancient woodland buffer, and that starts to then give us our developable area. And then that's how it starts to take shape as a master plan as we plot the blocks and so on. And that becomes a sort of a landscape feature in the site. So we're turning a constraint into a potential opportunity there. Viability is another big one in the planning world. I'm not a development surveyor. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert in this, but the underlying thing is that you have to have sites need to be deliverable. There needs to be thought about Section 106 and SIL early on in the process. All of that affects viability. And as I say, we would tend to work with our viability consultants from day one. Before Ewan puts pen to paper, we'd say to them, what does the market want in this sort of area? What should we be designing for? And then we're on to sort of potentially how will they be disposing of the site? Will they just be looking for a positive pre-application inquiry from the local authority? Will they go to full planning? Will they just go for outline? It's all that sort of thing we need to factor into the strategy early on. So feasibility, this is to us is sort of the way you should really be starting all your projects. So we would sit down together, we'd work out sort of from a planning and design perspective, what are the opportunity constraints, where can you develop on the site, look at the policy context, so are you in the green belt, what sort of angles do you need to work from a planning perspective to get a consent. Looking at different options, we'd often start with sort of a commercial option and a residential option, and we'd look at different densities within the residential options to what's going to generate the highest land value. And then working on sort of market intelligence and what does the market want in terms of, say, residential units. So this is just about why feasibility is important. So these are some of the things we're looking at. Are you going to get planning consent first first off, because there's no point going ahead and doing a design if you're never going to get planning permission for it. We then look at sort of principles of development. What sort of capacity could you get on the site? Some of that's driven by sort of transport and trip generation, transport movements, whether you're in an urban context or a rural context and so on. And it helps with the sort of, you go onto your pre-application inquiry and you can demonstrate to the council that you've actually thought about how the site works rather than just charged in with a design. So that's the sort of the sweet spot in the middle there, really. What you often find is if you go to an architectural practice or you just work with an architect, the architect will come up with a design that they think works for the site.
We did.
And it's not necessarily mindful of sort of the planning constraints and the viability constraints. So we have to drag them back from over here into this part in the middle. And this is how I think it should all work, really, in practice. It starts off with planning. Can you get planning permission for the site? You know, what are the broad policy issues to deal with? Then you're working on sort of the viability. What's the demand for in this area? What's going to work from that perspective? And then you start to put pen to paper on the design and think about that. That then feeds into, you've got a design that's realistic in planning and viability terms. Is then more likely to achieve planning permission, and then you start to realise value on it. And it all cascades like that. So these are some of the lessons that we've learned through the process. So one of them is that working with a multidisciplinary practice like Savills obviously pays dividends. We've got all the consultants in-house. We can take agency advice on what type of units are going to sell and that sort of thing. You've got to keep the architect under control. That's the big one.
I really don't want to put that in, but
we generally tend to get on fairly well on a day-to-day basis, but we do sort of we butt heads every now and again, don't we? So yeah. Policy and legislative changes is another big one. As I say, you know, often people aren't aware of things that are changing on a smaller scale, like neighbourhood plans coming in. That can present a real opportunity for new development, and PD rights is one we're always keeping an eye on. And then finally, just to say, the property market is key. You know, knowing what is going to sell at the end of the day before you start designing a scheme. Right, I'm going to hand over to Ewan now.
Okay, I thought sort of best scenario is basically give you an example of a project in kind. Won't mention the name of the project, but essentially I'll start from the beginning of the journey and just talk you through to a positive outcome. Okay, it's a project we became involved with in early 2018 as a result of this. Nothing that anybody wants to see, but client owned a substantial farm dwelling in the national park in West Sussex. There's a existing building just here, an old farmstead, and lots of old agricultural buildings, and the farm's kind of basically winding down. And they were wanting to move from their main house, principal residence, and create a new bespoke feature retirement home here for themselves, for him and his wife and all the sort of grandkids and everything. They went through a whole process of appointing an architect, went through a whole year-long process of getting into planning, and the proposals, by reasons of its scale, bulk, massing, design, I've read this so many times, design would result in an assertive and prominent addition. So in other words, after a very long journey, architect's fees, all of the excitement of wanting to build a new home, they get a point-blank refusal and no. So start again. What happened was, I think they made the right decision. They got rid of the architect and they approached ourselves because we were at the moment also looking to sell their main house through our country house team. So we were made a formal introduction to them. Now, here are the drawings of the scheme that was refused. Hopefully, I think fairly it speaks for itself. It wasn't particularly imaginative. It was in a countryside setting. It was in the national park. This is like any house you'd see in any high street anywhere, not of any particular architectural quality. Also, a real important no here. It wasn't a straightforward house or an extension or an alteration. It needed a planning consultant from the outset. It needed multiple sort of disciplines, but essentially the architect's opinion was, I can do this all by myself. I don't need a planning consultant. Mistake. Yes, Luke, I know, I'm looking at you too. Presentation, again, I think presentation is key. You have to do up your game. You've got to produce quality drawings. It makes a difference. Your impression and how you present and make the building look beautiful. And then also, architect unwilling to adapt the design. Having gone through, and it's important whenever an application is refused, look at the history, look at the reasons for the refusal, find out why. In this case, the planning department came back and said, look, we're not quite happy with this. We think we maybe need to redesign, re-look at it. The architect came back and put a couple of Veluxes in the roof and said, oh, there you go, new design, fantastic. And it got refused. So, you know, don't feel bad for him at all. Right, next steps. Before we start designing, it's time with my colleague here, Andy, look at the site. It's in the national park. They want to increase the volume of the building by a substantial portion above 30%, which is always a challenge because 30% is how much you can generally increase a building by. So first of all, do historical, because the building has some historical interest. It's not listed, but it was considered that this end building here of a higher elevation was of interest. So find the old maps, understand how the site's evolved. Had a conversation with the client, said, look, do you have any old photographs of the farm? They went into a folder that was from the person that used to own their house back in 1945, and there was a photo album with these photographs of the original barn structures. See the cat slide roof here, the fact that it had much more of a feeling of enclosure. So we go, great, we've got something. So what we then did was, as a starter, before we started looking at designs, we did something called a farmstead appraisal, which was a sort of a, right, let's figure out the site. 1875, this is all done in Revit in 3D, so we modelled the site. This is how the site looked in 1875. You move forward, 1896, our little pop-up extension happens, a couple of buildings move and jig around. 1964, move forward, you've now got 20th century coming in, larger farms have a lot of a habit of changing over time, larger agricultural structures. And then you go forward to 1994, it was a pig farm, and you can see here it was full industrial use, a very large number of units to the north of the site. These buildings that actually are of lots of historic interest and probably would be listed now if our client hadn't knocked them down 30 years ago, have gone here, but we have photographs to prove that, so we have a better understanding of the site. So you can see here, 2018, their son has then gone and built a agricultural tie, nice move, house at the top, and he's living there, and this is the property down here and looking at what we can do here. And again, there's a chalk pit here which we discovered was actually used to build an underground basement underneath, which was interesting to again find that history. And you've got here up on the downs, and this looks down south over, not giving too much away, but you can see the Isle of Wight, the views are spectacular. So it's all about those views and the vistas looking south and southeast. So then we go, right, massing options. Again, walking before you can run. Let's look at what we can do. So we come up with a couple of very basic 3D models to approach the local authority, full engagement, meeting with them at their offices. And we look at option 1. Option 2, that the heritage officer picked up on this, very interesting. She said, right, I like that building. I don't think these are of any importance. Let's look at what we can do to work around that. Brilliant. They're buying into it. So we work up a design where we're looking to integrate this building and this structure here, but trying to re-enclose and create a courtyard. And you can see here, we're also looking at the fact that there's a garden here to the south. Now, the original maps from 1830 showed that there was a herb garden there and showed this layout. So let's look at that. Let's reintroduce that and bring that into the design. And also, at the same time, let's look at something a lot bigger than 30%, but we're working with the planners. Let's do it. Proceed finally with a scheme for a submission for planning. It just happened that I was also working on a scheme at the time in Sussex Square, where it had a lot of work designed by Sir Edward Lutyens, the architect. Big fan of his. So I probably was influenced by him a little bit. So this building, even though it has lots of contemporary architectural elements, again, design very important, it also has a lot of traditional materials. And again, you can see here, we also get a landscape consultant in, very important in the national park. So we're showing all of the trees and the flora and fauna and how everything works, how everything connects and goes through. Then, original proposals. Original proposals, I told the client they were being punchy, but they wanted 70% increase in volume. Okay, we'll go in for 70%. This was the original design, big chimney on the end. There's the original building maintained, big cat slide roof, big open windows looking out over the south. Love it to bits, great, fantastic. Planners come back, and guess what? It's just a little too large. We think it's just slightly too large. We need you to scale it back. Not a problem at all. We'd already planned for this. We're happy to have a conversation to adapt the scheme, to look at it. And if you can hopefully do a before and after, you can see there is the scale back. So it's still a substantial building, but we've pulled back the chimney, we've pulled back the roof. We've reduced the volume now to a 50% increase in volume. And planners essentially take a look at it. We get a little bit of pullback from the local authority landscape consultant internal, but then we manage to address her concerns. And we get planning permission. So we've fulfilled the client's brief entirely. We've got planning permission for a new dwelling within the national park, and they're very happy. And we're now, as we speak, producing a full detailed construction package, and it's very exciting, and it's going to start on site in September. So that's that. Reasons for the success. Can't emphasize it enough. Good design, good quality design, so important. Bad design, just there's no place for it, particularly when you're dealing with issues that aren't straightforward, and you need to have that at the forefront of everything. strong, trusted client relationship. Relationships with clients are so important. You've got to get them to buy in. They've got to trust you. You've got to trust them. You know, you want them to phone you up and express their opinions, and you've got to share ideas. You can't not have a good relationship with your client. Good consultant team. I mean, Andy was okay. Multidisciplinary, agency planning, architecture. The way that this tied in was, again, it was a great experience of, we've got James, who's our head of agency in Petworth, sells lots of properties around there. The client in question was looking to sell their house. He managed to, through a positive pre-app, sell their house. He's very happy with that. He made the referral to me. I brought in Andy and the team at planning. So we're all working collectively in very different disciplines that quite often will be separate together. And teamwork. Use of latest technology, again, also useful. We've just got over there on the table the Oculus Go system, where we modelled the building entirely in Revit, which is like a 3D version of AutoCAD, and we're able to show the client the building. So as the design changed and evolved, we showed the client the building changing and adapting so they could buy into it, because some clients just don't want to admit they can't read a floor plan or they can't understand a section. This is a great way of communicating it not only to them, but to the planners. And the ability to listen to adapt at planning stage. You can't just go in and say, I'm right, you're wrong. Even though you know you're right, you have to work on the basis that you've got to work with the planners, because ultimately they make the shots. And then I thought what I'd do is, after that, I'll just give you a couple of examples and snapshots of other projects that we've done. There's a project we were quite proud of in Haywards Heath. Client said, give me as much glass as possible, so we did. That entire elevation there, if I just go forwards, all of those doors fold back and slide back. There's a very slender, lightweight column here, and that entire roof is completely suspended by a very advanced set of calculations to make sure that roof was held up. So that was a cooperation with a local kitchen designer called Alistair Fleming Design, based in Lewis. Great kitchen designers. I couldn't afford them in a million years, but they do great work and they do really good kitchens and fit outs. And there's just a photograph through there. And there's the kitchen designs. And then just the tie-in to the project that I mentioned earlier that did influence me, because architects basically nick up ideas from other architects, it's no secret, but if we do it well and we adapt it well, that's the joy, that's how it should be. This is Sussex Square. At the back of it is this underground basement, which was originally built for this Lady Sackville West, for Sir Edward Lutyens in 1919. We're pretty sure that they had more of a client-architect relationship than just client-architect. It's on pretty good file that happened. I even spoke to someone from the Lutyens Trust and said, did they? And he went, yes, they did. So it's on record. Here's the space originally, underground, forgotten, 2 refused planning schemes because the architects came in, didn't understand the history. This one is grade 1 listed. So we went through the full process of understanding it, understanding the importance of it. And then once we'd got that and got the permission, very important, we put a massive hole in the ground and we cut a staircase through and we connected this space up. So we were able to create a 4-bed house on the back of Sussex Square that otherwise would have been useless to anybody. So client's very happy with that. And you can just see the finished results there. These photos are literally from a couple of weeks ago. There's the original Lutyens Arch, which we built an entire tanking system around because that space is actually underground. This is the garden over the top, and it's actually for sale now. And the reason why a client likes us a lot is that, talking numbers, why the hell not? They were originally estimated at the end sale value of this being 1.2 to 1.3. They got an estimate back from their estate agent at 1.82. So the point is, good design again makes a difference. And just a few final projects. Christ Hospital, we're involved with them too. They had a previous architect, wasn't quite understanding the issues of heritage and listed building. So we came in, we suspended the entire 16th century timber frame in thin air and built an entire new building around it. I think those are probably the best student accommodation blocks anywhere in England. So yeah, go to Christ Hospital, they know how to do things. And then just summarising, this is the team. Head of the department, myself there, my colleague Michael, who borrowed my tie on the day. That doesn't look awkward at all. We flipped the photograph to try and deviate away from the fact that it was that obvious, but now I'm completely drawing your attention to it. He's an architectural technologist. Alex is a great Part 1 level architect, doing fantastic work as well. Sam, who's sat here as well, technologist looking to further out a career in building surveying, which we're hoping to support and looking to support. A chartered surveyor, quantity surveyor, in-house as well, Bill. He gives me the hairy eyeball very regularly and sort of goes, no, and we always sort of joke that everything's £1 million, but the point is he does fantastic work, and it's also really good to have when a client wants to look at a scheme and wants to come up with a design, the first thing you've got to do is understand what your budget is and what your expectations are. There's nothing worse than getting planning for something you can't build, and there is nothing more soul destroying than value engineering or killing a scheme. You've got to have that conversation at the beginning, and you've got to tell the client accurately what this is going to cost. That's why he comes in. And Terry Edsett, my predecessor, because he has a bow tie. Terry does fantastic watercolours, hand-drawn drawings, specialist in historic buildings. He's a consultant now, but we still use him regularly. And he's just up for an award this year at the Sussex Heritage Trust Awards for Petworth Real Tennis Courts, which we built an extension on a couple of years ago. And he did a fantastic scheme there with local contractors Pilbeam. So, yeah, that's everything. I think I've hopefully talked enough. You've now got the opportunity to ask as many questions as you want to an architect and a planner for free. So go for it.